at noon program. What do we got? Today is August what? 16th. All right, time is flying. All right, and today we're going to have the opportunity. I'm going to join you in learning a little bit about ducks, duck decoys, carvers early in this area, the Thousand Islands. As I understand, Cape Vincent through Alex Bay. For the most part, we do have some Canadians in the audience, so thank you for coming today. But with that, I'm going to introduce Tom Eckert. Tom Eckert's been attached to or connected with the museum for many, many years as a volunteer. So he's seen a lot of ducks coming in, a lot of ducks leaving, and he's kept the best. And he's going to talk about some of those today. So, Tom, the program is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, I am a decoy collector, and I've been at it for 50 years. So I really appreciate the Thousand Islands decoys, and happy to talk about decoys. I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction. My talk can be divided basically into 3 parts. I'm going to talk a little bit about an introduction, a history to hunting decoys. Where did they come from? How did this concept occur? I will talk about some selected Thousand Island area carvers. I can't cover them all, it would take too long. And I'm going to talk a little bit about decoy collecting. If you're interested, this would be a way to somewhat get started. Okay, let's begin with what is a decoy? And I said, well, for a definition, we go to Webster, and of course that really dates me. The fact that I would suggest using a book rather than using your phone and just look it up. But you know, a lure, a bait, a person or thing that lures another into a dangerous situation, that's kind of getting there. But we're going to talk about wooden hunting decoys, so I can do a better job. And a preferred definition, man-made representations of wild birds intended to deceive wildfowl and lure them within range of hunters. And this came from a book by Robert Shaw. I do have a copy of that book on the back table if you're interested in looking at it. Robert Shaw was a curator at the Shelburne Museum in Vermont. He's written a lot of different things about pottery, about quilts, and everything else. He lectures about American folk art. And I really want to emphasize that man-made representations. I mean, that's what we're talking about, is something that's made to look like a duck to bring other ducks in to range of hunters. A lot of other ways you could try and attract ducks. You could use live birds, tame birds. You could bait them. You can use nets and different kinds of traps. But we're talking about decoys. Okay, waterfowl have always been an important source of food. I think that everyone realizes that. If they go to archaeological digs, there's always waterfowl bones. Feathers were also taken from the birds. Most waterfowl don't have the fancy plumage that the egrets and things like that had. But birds, the meat, the plumage has always been important in different cultures. And hunting has been depicted in various paintings and carvings on the walls of tombs and things like that. And they used a lot of different methods to try and capture them. I mentioned that, you know, you can you bait them, you can use nets and things like that. Here's a couple of paintings on Egyptian tombs from way back when. The upper one seems to show someone behind a blind with some sort of a rope attached to a trap or something. These tombs were usually for the pharaoh, so that's probably an important person, perhaps the pharaoh seated there. But they would hunt waterfowl. The bottom one shows people out there with throwing sticks. They also have spears and that sort of thing, and they're trying to collect waterfowl and fish for food. Here's one from the Etruscan tomb. Again, you see people there with a sling, it looks like. He's throwing stones. You see fish jumping. They're trying to catch fish. If you don't remember your history, and I didn't, I had to look it up, Etruscan refers to Etruria, which was a province in central Italy. Here's a really odd one. This is in India, and they would float and anchor gourds out in a pond, an embayment that was frequented by waterfowl. And once the ducks became accustomed to these gourds, they wouldn't pay them any attention. They'd swim around amongst them. They would take another gourd that had been hollowed out so they could put it over their head. And they would slip into the water and paddle out there slowly in amongst the ducks. And when they got close enough, they'd grab them. Wow. And I read an account of this in South America where they were doing it, and they said if you grabbed it quick enough and pulled, it went right down, and then you could either wring its neck or drown the bird. But Other ducks were accustomed to ducks diving. They wouldn't think anything of this duck suddenly disappearing. If you're a little bit slow, obviously they'd start squawking and everything, and they would scare them away. But a rather bizarre way of hunting ducks.
Now, did the phrase "out of their gourds" come from this?
I don't think so, but that's a possibility. Maybe Tom can look that up.
Yeah. Maybe I'll Google it on my phone.
There you go. Here's another thing from the Netherlands. They have this large fenced-in area with those long funnel-shaped cages, and they were using boats to drive the waterfowl into the cages. And once the birds got within the mouth of the cage, then a person could appear and spook them, and as they drove them further back, they became more and more confined, and eventually they were to a point where you could catch them with nets or even by hand. Obviously, you'd say, well, why don't the birds just fly away from that? Well, waterfowl, all birds, they molt. And waterfowl molt all their flight feathers at one time, and for a period in the summer, they become flightless. And up at Wilson Hill, the wildlife management area, they have a goose drive, which is basically a similar type thing. They're herding these geese in so they can capture hundreds of them. That's for research purposes and to ban the birds to assess them. They're not trying to do it for meat. But these sort of things were used. Here's supposedly an enhanced or improved version of that duck cage, a long funnel. They have some, I don't think the pointer will work. Now, it doesn't work against the screen. It works against other things. They have some live ducks in the front to attract the wild birds, but also they use dogs. And it's a curious fact that ducks tend to be attracted to a dog running along the shoreline. And as long as the water is reasonably deep, they know they can easily outswim the dog. So they will come in close to see what this dog is doing. And there's actually a place up in Newfoundland where they call it tolling, and they have a screened area, and the hunters throw a stick out there, and they have this dog trained to run along the shoreline. And as the ducks come in close enough within range, they can shoot them. Well, this was that same sort of thing. The tolling dog would run along there. The ducks would get attracted to the mouth of the funnel, and then one of the hunters would appear, scare them back into the funnel, and chase them down.
And what time period is this?
1200, 1400, something like that. Well, probably even later than that, up into the 1600s. You know, this was before they weren't using guns so much. They were trying to just trap the ducks back in the funnel, and then they'd catch them by hand or with a small net. Okay, but one thing that was unique about these different paintings, these drawings, these scenes from the tombs, none of them show the use of decoys as I defined it, a man-made representation. They didn't use decoys. And kind of unexpectedly, decoys are essentially a North American invention. They were initially developed and used by the native indigenous peoples. If I gave this talk 30 years ago, I would have said they're absolutely a unique North American invention. They have uncovered a few duck-like things in archaeological digs since, and suggestion that maybe they had sort of like decoys, man-made representations in other areas, but there's no record of these actually being used for hunting, whereas there are records of the indigenous American people using decoys for hunting. Although decoys were an American Indian invention or idea, the word obviously wasn't from their language. And so where did that word come from? And one theory is that it's a contraction of the Dutch words, endiku, meaning that duck cage, that great big funnel-like duck cage, were apparently called these endiku, or however it's properly pronounced. And that's where the word decoy came from and became used in the English language. Okay, the earliest known American decoys date to about 1000 AD. They were excavated from a cave in Nevada. The people at that time are believed to be largely nomadic. There was somewhat more water out in that area than there is now. And they would use the caves as temporary storage for nets and things like that that they would use for hunting for their subsistence living. Caves were used to store items. And the decoys that were there, they're all made of natural materials, but they were preserved by the dry climate. Grass, tulle, things like that. In a wet climate, they would break down and rot away within a few years. And two kinds of decoys were found. They found canvasbacks, and they were made from bulrushes, and they did have ochre and charcoal and things like that. They could use red and black pigments, and then they had feathers on the side. And then there were other bulrush forms that they put the skin of a harvested bird over. So there's two kinds of decoys. And this is a picture from that excavation back in 1924. Because these are organic materials, they could radiocarbon date them, and that's where they came up with a date of about 1000 AD, well before any of the European peoples came to this country, and arguably out there in Nevada, it's far away. If any of the Vikings or something managed to get to Newfoundland, that idea would not have cross-contaminated. Here's a close-up of one of those decoys, and if you know what a draped canvasback looks like, that's a reasonably good representation. The white feathers on the side held down with twine, the black and red pigments used to color the head and the bill, that sort of thing. And they would use these to get close enough to shoot at the birds with their bow and arrows, apparently. They might have used throwing sticks. They might have actually had nets, too, where the birds would get in. But I remember reading something that they were talking about the oyster tongers in New Jersey, and they were saying that they commonly found arrowheads. And the supposition was that the Indians were shooting at ducks and water birds, and they would occasionally lose some arrows, and there was a lot of arrowheads out in these swamp areas along the New Jersey coast. The Indians have continued to make those kinds of decoys for years, and this is a contemporary Paiute canvasback. It's the mounted skin of a duck, and it's put over a bulrush form. And I can remember reading other accounts of very early duck hunting where they would talk about, you go out, you manage to shoot one duck, you prop it up for a decoy. As that bird attracts more, you start killing more birds, your decoy spread increases. And so these sorts of decoys were commonly used. And remember, the Native Americans were basically a Stone Age people. They did not have metal tools. And they were able, with the flint tools and things like that, to shape bulrushes, to skin birds and things like that, and make these kinds of decoys.
What's the definition of bulrush?
It's a plant.
They're,
Kind of like a cattail.
yeah, something like that, a cattail. I used to know the name of it from my botany classes, but they're a water
It's like a
plant.
reed?
Reed that sticks up out of the water, yes. Yes. And they have a little bit of a tassel up at the top, nowhere near as big as the Phragmites or the cattails, but they have a little. And there was a lot of them that were growing out there in that area, Nevada, around Great Salt Lake and those lakes and stuff that were out there at that time. Okay, so there are some actual decoys found from before the European settlers, Asian settlers came here to the U.S. The earliest written account was by this Baron, I don't know how to pronounce it in French, but Laton. He was hunting in marshes in Lake Champlain, and notice that this is about 650 years later than those decoys were found, and it's basically all the way across the North American continent. So this was an idea, a concept that was all across amongst the native peoples of North America. He talks about them making huts, which we would call blinds today, and they could hide in those huts. And for decoys, they have the skins of geese. Bustards is a European name for the different kinds of waterfowl, including ducks. And they would stuff them with hay and put them out there for to attract the ducks close enough, again, for them to shoot at with their bows and arrows or slings or whatever they were using. So the idea of decoys were there amongst the North American peoples for centuries, all across North America. The European settlers were very quick to adopt Native American hunting and fishing techniques. They were quite dependent on hunting and fishing wildlife for their subsistence. And at some point, now the Europeans did have metal tools, and at some point they used the woodworking skills and tools brought from Europe to create more durable decoys carved from wood. And exactly when and where this occurred isn't known. You know, things like this often occur many times at different locations. But based on the written accounts, by the late 1700s, North Americans, in a number of locations were routinely using carved and painted decoys. That basically is where the idea of decoys came from. This idea later went back to Europe and places like that, and there are now European, Italian, things like that, decoys. But the idea basically seems to have come over from North America. In writing about the decoys in his book, Bob Shaw said they basically were a response to the abundance of wildfowl in early America and the desire to exploit these wild birds. Remember that Europe at that time, most of the land was owned by lords and kings and that sort of thing. The average person couldn't hunt. And North America was just wide open. And most of the early settlers had guns, and very quickly the connection, hey, this is a good source of food. And of course it wasn't just ducks, it was deer and everything else, the bison and everything. The demand for waterfowl decoys increased dramatically in the 1800s. That's when population in North America really began to increase. Market hunting began in earnest around 1840, and part of that was the population increase. Part of it also was improvements in transportation. Now with trains and steamboats and things like that, it was a lot easier to get around this vast country. It was a lot easier to get down to the marshes where ducks might be. It was also easier for the market gunners to send the birds back to market. Wild birds, of course, and fish and things like that they break down, become inedible very quickly. So you do need a decent transportation system. There are obviously improvements in firearms and everything like that. It became a lot easier to hunt ducks. I can't imagine trying to go out there in the old days and hunt ducks with a flintlock or something like that, because there was a noticeable lag between that flint spark and then the actual bullet going out. And to try and lead a duck, probably they shot most of them on the water. But the modern firearms greatly improved the ability of hunters to harvest ducks. Commercial sale was actually outlawed in 1918, but a lot of people had developed taste for waterfowl. I've heard stories about guys, even in the 30s and 40s locally, that would go out and hunt and sell waterfowl to some friends. And they were essentially market gunning. I mean, these were just ducks. And, you know, a lot of people go, they're there for the taking, and people like them, and I can supply that demand.
Do you know why it was halted in 1918?
Basically because of the declines in some of the ducks. They had a huge drought in some of that area too. And so the habitat for duck reproduction went way down, and waterfowl populations began to decline precipitously. And there was a lot of concern about the need to conserve what was left. And so that was part of the emphasis behind the decrease, the outlawing of commercial harvest.
And that was nationally?
I believe so. It was federal law, yes, the Waterfowl Act. And by basically 1960, wooden hunting decoys were largely been replaced. I remember when I was first starting duck hunting in the 60s and stuff like that, you know, the thought never occurred to me to get a wooden decoy. You get to the herder's catalog, and there were plastic decoys and these fiber decoys that Sears and Roebuck and J.C. Penney sold and things like that, and that's what you used. Decoys representing more than 60 species of waterfowl have been identified, and they're produced in two basic forms. The floaters are the typical duck decoy. It floats in the water. There's usually an anchor line that goes down to the bottom and a little anchor. Stick-ups, the shorebirds, the things like that they hunted, they basically run along the beach. So those decoys were supported by a single stick stuck in the sand. Goose hunters out in the fields typically use some sort of stick-up type decoy. So there's these two basic types of decoys. They were originally intended as tools, but today they are recognized as a North American form of folk art, and they are highly collectible, and I can vouch for that. They were produced by a lot of different commercial enterprises. Probably the most famous of the factories was the Mason factory out in Detroit. They started around 1880, something like that. They ended in 1924, but they just produced hundreds of thousands of decoys and sent them all over North America. and they are one of the main factory decoys that are found today. A lot of people that just collect them. Closer, there was the Stevens factory, Harvey and George Stevens down in Weedsport, near the north end of Cuba Lake. And they produced decoys from about 1880 to, I think it was 1904, when George died. Harvey had died, predeceased him. But beyond the factories, there were a lot of local craftsmen, and they often utilized a regional carving and painting style. If you show the average decoy collector a decoy from the Chesapeake, he will immediately identify it as a Chesapeake style decoy, or Illinois River style, the styles from New Jersey, and the styles from the Thousand Islands area. They're reasonably recognizable to the knowledgeable decoy collector. And you know, a lot of people, when you're collecting decoys, are you interested in the factory birds? Do you like the local birds? What do you do? And if you collect for a while, like I have, you probably change your mind several times, and your collection refocuses on a certain area of things. I'm most interested in the Thousand Islands area decoys. Okay, so St. Lawrence River, I've said this is one of the recognizable regional styles of decoys. So what does a typical example look like? Well, there's a lot of exceptions, but most of them are flat bottom. Most don't have keels. These are the vintage decoys I'm talking about. Most have solid bodies. There were some hollow ones made, especially more in Canadian waters. Prince Edward County had a lot of hollow decoys over by Toronto. But most from the Thousand Islands area, most were solid bodies. And the ballast weights tended to be attached directly to the bottoms. They were just, these are pieces of lead. Sometimes they were actually cast in a mold, and they were just nailed or screwed directly to the bottom of the decoy. In Ontario, they were much more likely to use swing weights, where they would put a weight on some sort of little swinging thing, and so it would get lower in the water. They felt, in most respects, that is better for the stability of the decoy with less weight. So different regions, different areas, people tended to do somewhat different things. In many cases, they also tended to hunt different species, because not all ducks are equally distributed across North America. And in particular, in the Thousand Islands area, they had what they called the long neck or high neck decoys, especially in Alex Bay. And also they did what they called reverse feather stippling. And basically they're using a fairly long curved paintbrush, and they're dipping it in paint, and they're stippling or dabbing little feather marks on the bird. And I believe the correct term is these are concave feathers. They point, the U-shape points towards the head, and that's actually backwards from what a live duck is. If you look at a live duck, the feathers point towards the back. They're convex. People have wondered, why did they do it that way? Well, that unfortunately just been lost to time. You know, people say, well, it was easier to do it this way. I don't buy any of that. Okay, I'm going to talk about 3 different carvers from the local area. There's a lot of people I could talk about. My computer's got thousands and thousands of pictures on it. I'm sure after a couple hours I'd see eyes glazing over and everything else. So I'm going to limit it to these 3. When I first started, 3 local guys. When I first started collecting, these were called the Big 3. They had fairly large outputs. Over the lifetimes, they probably each produced in the neighborhood of 4,000 to 5,000 decoys. They also were very important, influential people locally. They influenced a lot of other people's carving, and they helped to perfect and develop this Thousand Islands style. After a brief presentation on these 3 guys, I'm going to talk a little bit about Ken Harris. And part of the reason for that is Ken is more recent. Some of you may have actually gone to his shop down on Route 3 in Woodville. If not, you probably, if you're at all interested in decoys or know about them, you've heard of them. Your uncle, your father, someone has some decoys by Ken Harris. And he was, for a period, a full-time maker. He produced tens of thousands of decoys. In 1 year, he's estimated to have made over 4,600 decoys. So, I mean, he made lots and lots of decoys, and again, the more common something is, the more people are exposed to it, and the more likely they are to become interested in it and collect. It seems a little bit counterintuitive, but sometimes things are too rare to be very collectible.
So he was the most prolific of these four that you cite?
Yes, by far. Yeah.
4,600 by himself he produced?
No, it was basically a little factory.
Okay.
He had 2 or 3 people helping him most of the time. He did, I'll talk a little bit more. But remember that Wheeler and Denny, they both carved for over 50 years. Frank Coombs was probably close to 25 years. So when we talk about them making 4,000 or 5,000 decoys in their lifetime, that isn't thousands in any one year, it's just hundreds in any one year. Decoy carving for all these people was a part-time business. They used it to help supplement their incomes. So I'm going to go ahead and start on Chauncey Wheeler. In many respects, this is from a 1925 hunting trip. He had a patron, Mr. Hayden, who encouraged him to come down to Georgia with him, and he was on this 6-week hunting trip down in there. And this is a photo from that period.
Well, that's the only thing. It hasn't named it.
He carved a lot of things over the years. He did carve some miniatures. He carved some half-wing flyers. And the next photograph, in the back behind the 3 men, you'll see those half flyers mounted on plaques. Some were on plaques, some were not. These particular ones were. And the 3 men there, it shows up on top there, John Fuller, Bob Dingman, and Chauncey Wheeler. Chauncey Wheeler is holding that draw knife there in his right hand. That's a tool for shaping wood. Bob Dingman, the man in the middle, is an interesting character. There were a lot of Dingmans down in Alexandria Bay. Ed Dingman has had decoys attributed to him. Some people will attribute decoys to Bob Dingman, but none of the early decoy literature actually shows that. And so it's a bit of a question, did Bob Dingman make decoys or not? His obituary in the paper notes that he was a craftsman, that he carved lots of things, but it's and we know that he made many of the plaques that Chauncey Wheeler mounted those half flyers on. He was very good friends with Wheeler. He's in the shop all the time, uncertain whether or not he actually made hunting decoys. Well, let's look at a couple of Wheeler decoys. Here's a classic pair of canvas backs. These are smaller decoys, especially smaller compared to most canvas backs. They're life size. They have rather high heads, and you can get a sense for the Alex Bay high heads. These would be considered high heads. And I'm saying they have beveled sides, and by that I mean the lower sides slant inwards a little bit. And so if you were to try and measure the width of the body block that the decoy was made from, the maximum width would be about halfway down the side. He also made ones with what I call rounded sides, where the maximum width is at the very bottom. So he made these 2 basic body styles, the beveled side, the rounded side. The heads, I found his carving to be quite consistent in the top of the head, the head part, but the length of the neck, the position of the head on the body could vary dramatically, which gives a very different impression of some of these decoys. But you look at his bills, you look at the head, the basic carving style is very distinctive. Here's a couple more Wheeler decoys. These are hen broadbills. Broadbills, bluebills, basically the same difference. These are larger decoys. They're probably 16, 17 inches long. And these are the ones that I said have rounded sides. The maximum width of the body block is right down there on the bottom of the decoy body. And if you look at these, you can also get a sense for that reverse feather stippling. You can see those little darker feathers on the sides and top of the bird. And basically he would have put a lighter brown paint on, let it dry, and then he would, using a brush, he would have dabbed these darker stipple marks to represent feathering. And that was very classic of the Alexandria Bay decoys, these reverse feather stipple marks. The bird with the lower bird, the head is a little bit lower, it's a little bit bigger, and I call it a snuggle head style or whatever. They're pretty rare. I've only known of 3 or 4 of that particular style. Most were that more upright head, and some of them had very long necks. Here's just a general group of Wheeler decoys. The Drake Goldeneye in the top left-hand corner has got rounded sides. It's a smaller decoy, probably only about 14 inches long overall length. The Drake Canvasback in the top right, that's a big decoy. That's almost 19 inches long. That has somewhat beveled sides. The Black Duck, bottom left, is more of a medium-sized decoy, about 17, 18 inches long. It has beveled sides. And then the Drake Broadbill in the lower right, that's a rounded side decoy. It's medium size again, about 16, 17 inches, but that's a blind decoy. Tom?
So I'm inexperienced on this. You said these are like fabric back? What did you call canvas back? And I look at them, to me they look like they're just made of wood. Am I missing something?
It's the name of the duck.
It's just a name. It has nothing to do with the...
Right.
Okay.
The mature drakes had a kind of a gray vermiculated back, and it reminded people of canvas, I guess. I mean,
All right.
It's
you
the
know,
species of the duck.
So it's not the
You're right.
material.
It's the
no, it's the name of the duck.
Okay.
And where those names came from and how they evolved over time, you know, again, a lot of that's lost to history probably. But I mentioned that broadbill, the lower right-hand corner, it's blind. Eyes were hard to come by back in the 1920s and things like that. And in many cases, they used shoe buttons. Some guys used tacks. And sometimes they just left the eyes off. I mean, a lot of people would argue if a duck is close enough to tell whether or not the decoy has eyes, he's plenty close enough to shoot at. So you don't really need to bother with the expense of eyes. And probably, you know, 10% or so of Wheeler's decoys were made without eyes. Okay, the heads are really a distinctive part of a decoy. To me, they require the most carving skill, the most finesse to make. So let's look at some Wheeler heads. Here's a close-up of a hen broadbill. What do we see when we look there? Well, one thing, there's an eye groove, and the yellow arrow kind of points to that groove across the eye. That was a distinctive characteristic of most Thousand Islands decoys, the eye groove. Some decoys, the heads are just rounded. Some decoys have large, bulging lower cheeks and things like that. So the head styles are quite important to identifying the decoys. Besides the eye groove, you'll notice there's that little notch right up on the top of the bill, the forehead area, and wood has been removed from there. It's been inletted. And that was a distinctive feature of Wheeler and also at least a couple of other Alex Bay carvers, but it was a very distinctive thing. There's no wood removed elsewhere around the line that separates the bill from the face of the decoy. Talking about Canadian decoys, especially in the Rideau, the nickel family, and things like that, in many cases, they removed wood from the face, right where it joins the bill, so the bill appeared to be wider than the face of the decoy. And then some of the other members of the family did the opposite. They removed wood from the back of the bill, so the bill appeared to be inletted into the face of the decoy. And I mean, that's the way that wood and carved the decoy. And in many cases, these people had a lot of time on their hands. They didn't have TV back then, they didn't have cell phones. And so what were they doing? And I've always said decoys really had to decoy two things. They had to obviously decoy the ducks. But these were pretty expensive items back in the day. They're handmade items. They had to decoy the hunter. They had to convince someone to lay out money for these things. And you know, initially you talk about, well, they were selling them for 75 cents or $1 or $2. But that was quite a bit of money back in the day. Tom?
Have you ever seen where there's a certain nationality, like French people were the carvers, maybe not the English, maybe not other? Do you see a national? Somebody recently explained to me that all the carvers in Clayton live in Frenchtown. I don't know if that was coincidental, or was there the French were more into carving?
No. I will talk about Sam Denny, and he was French-Canadian. Yeah. No. You go down into Quebec, Lake St. Francis, and places like that, there were a lot of decoy carvers down there. So yes, there were a lot of decoy carvers in French parts of Canada and people of French heritage, but no, it was not unique to them as far as I know. Arguably, the decoy capital of the world is Chesapeake Bay. And I'm not sure what the ethnicity of Chesapeake Bay area is, but I've never heard of a lot of French there. Down in Louisiana, you get down in the Cajun country, there was a lot of decoy carving there, but there were huge marshes and there was a lot of duck hunting. Another feature of the bill is you notice there's what they call a mandible line, and then there's another little line carved out on the tip of the bill. If you actually look at a live duck, there are a number of different lines and marks and things like that on the bill. One is right on the very tip of the bill. There's a little dark raised area. It's called the nail. This did have some black paint put there, but wheelers seldom carved the nail in the decoys. Some guys did, and again, that's a little distinctive feature you would look for if you're trying to identify who might have carved what. Here's another wheeler. This is a little hen golden eye. We can see the same features. There's that eye groove. It's quite very prominent on this example. There's that inletted area up at the base of the bill. And there is a somewhat shorter carved mandible line there. This bird also, you can see, has nostrils in it. The previous one I showed had nostrils. Most of the decoys had nostrils pressed in. A lot of cases they talked about them using just a screwdriver, the end of a screwdriver, to poke it into the wood, or sometimes just a simple gouge and pop out a little divot of wood to represent the nostril at the top of the decoy. So that's Chauncey Wheeler. A very brief introduction to Chauncey Wheeler. We do have an exhibit right over there of Chauncey Wheeler, his workbench and things like that, and there's more information there. Okay, let's talk about Frank Coombs. This is a photograph from Decoys at Thousand Islands. Quite a pile of ducks. His wife Abby is sitting behind him, and supposedly she often accompanied him on his hunting trips. And there's a missing ring finger. Now it's hard to see, but if we blow it up, there's the missing ring finger on his left hand. He was injured in a 1916 hunting accident. Prior to that, he had started a career as a barber. And because of the damage to his hand and stuff, he didn't feel he could do barbering well enough. And he was lamenting about his future and things like that. He was talking to Chauncey Wheeler. And Chauncey Wheeler says, well, maybe you can't barber, but I bet you can carve decoys. And Chauncey Wheeler encouraged him to carve decoys, and Frank Coombs gave Wheeler credit for the start, the impetus to begin carving decoys commercially. It was obviously just part-time for him. Here's a Frank Coombs hen broadbill, and I think this example shows that reverse feather stippling very well. But first, very high head. The back of the neck is really quite straight. The head set forward on the body, and it really gives the bird this alert, upright attitude. And a lot of people will say, well, that represents a frightened duck. With duck, if you go to a pond and you frighten ducks or something like that, before they don't take off instantaneously. They raise their head up and they look around, what's going on, they become alert. And people said, why would you do that? And there's a story that Coombs was down in Florida, and they were feeding birds, broadbills, and they had grain and stuff like that, and it was a tourist attraction. And he noticed that as more ducks were flying into this baited area, the ones on the water would kind of stretch up their necks and look around to see who was coming. And so it occurred to him that maybe that high, erect posture of the head is not necessarily a bad thing. And people have also argued that if you're hunting ducks in late season on the St. Lawrence, having a higher head is good because it takes longer for the icicle to develop off the end of the bill. You know, you're out there in really cold weather and the decoys start to ice up, the high heads seem to do somewhat better. But again, that shows that reverse feather stippling very well. He would have painted that lighter brown color on the chest and the back and the sides, let it dry, and then used a curved brush, slightly curved brush, and dab those darker paint marks on there to simulate feathering. And of course, all these decoys were painted with lead-based paint, oil-based paint. It tended to dry rather slowly, so they had a lot of opportunity to texture things, to blend things. You can notice on the wing speculum there, the white slash on the bird, how the paint has been drawn back and feathered to have more of a soft edge. And most of the guys were very good at that. It really is technique. And again, this whole notion, you're trying to produce a decoy that is also attractive to the guy that's going to pay me the money. And they would fancy up the paint, I think, to enhance the salability of the decoys, and it's probably more important in that regard than it was in the ability of that decoy to bring a duck in. Just my thoughts on the matter.
The reverse feathers, is that normally what people are doing now? Is reverse?
No, most people do the other way.
Okay, alright,
It was an Alex Bay thing.
okay.
Why it happened? Like I say, I mean, some people said, oh, it's easier to do it that way. Well, I don't know, you turn the brush around, what's the difference, you know?
Turn the decoy around.
Yeah, and most of these guys, and they're pretty good observers, they notice things about the decoys, or about the ducks and everything else to represent it with their decoys. They knew which way the feathers pointed.
Right.
So this is a Drake broadbill by Frank Coombs. I just want to talk a little bit about it. You notice the back of that and the sides of it are combed. And what I mean by that is they would have painted the lighter color, the whitish color on, let it dry, and then they put black paint on the top. And as it started to dry, started to get a little bit tacky, they would take a graining comb and they would squiggle it across the top, and it was trying to simulate the vermiculation of the feathers on the decoy. And that was a very common technique used. If you go back and look at the old furniture and stuff, I mean, they used a lot of sometimes just softwood, and they would use sponge work or graining combs and things like that to texture the wood and to simulate nice bird's eye maple or something else, and you know, to enhance the appearance of the wood. Certainly not unique just to decoys.
Were most of the decoys made out of the same type of wood, or did it vary?
It varied a bit because of what was available. I mean, these were tough times for most of these people. They were rather frugal men. White cedar was preferred. It tends to be fairly soft, it's more rot resistant and everything else. It's somewhat easier to carve. They would use pine, they would use whatever was available. I'm sure in many cases they recycled old dock boards, telephone poles and things like that. And what were those made of? Well, in some cases they were made of cedar, but they would use whatever wood was available. The heads, because they're a little bit more finely carved, they tended to use pine or slightly harder wood in most cases. But wood was a huge issue for a lot of these guys. You know, they would have to get it, they would have to let it dry and everything else. Moving ahead a little bit to Sam Denny, supposedly there was an area over by 3 Mile Bay where they had harvested a lot of these big cedar trees for shingles. And they would cut them up higher and leave these big, more expanded stumps. And those dried stumps were still, even after years, were still in pretty good shape. And he really loved that dry cedar from those old stumps for carving some of his decoys, if he could get it.
So what percentage of the decoys were made from one piece of wood versus, you know, having to glue the heads on to the body or whatever, do you know?
Virtually all of them were at least 2 pieces, the body and then the head. The head was a separate piece. That's a good point to make, yeah. The head's a separate piece. And in some cases, the bigger ducks or like geese, bigger birds, things like that, to simulate them, they would laminate 2 pieces of wood together just to make a thicker body block to begin with. Almost all decoys vary a little bit. And I think the reason for that is they used what was available. You know, a lot of these guys would get the wood from a local smith or from the local lumber mill, and they were cheap. They would fix wood, they would put in large pieces to fix a bad spot. If there was heartwood, they would cut it out and inlet a strip of wood. You would say to yourself, well, back then wood was cheap, but it wasn't to them. And these are just hunting decoys, nothing fancy. And they fixed and used what wood was available. But cedar was the preferred, white cedar if you could get it, for the body. Okay, here's a couple of Coombs Golden Eyes. We're talking about body blocks and things like that. Notice that the Drake Golden Eye in the top right-hand corner is a bit thicker wood. I assume that was what they had. You know, they had the thick wood, and rather than plane it down or try and remove the 1/2 inch or so, he said, good enough. And it's always possible, too, that someone said, I want some bigger, thicker decoys. I think they loom up. They show better when they're floating on the water. than these thinner decoys. And so there's both the possibility of a special order from some hunter and just using what was available. The hen goldeneye in the bottom left, again, you can see that very nice stipple painting and paint blending on that. The original paint by these guys was something of importance to most decoy collectors. Really good quality paint really enhances the value, the collectability of a decoy. And that's a very nice example of a hen goldeneye, the very nice stippling. Here's a couple of black ducks by Frank Coombs. Oh, someone can turn their phone off. Okay, how do you dismiss it? There. That top black duck was probably made about 1930, somewhere in that area. It's a comparatively earlier decoy for Coombs, and it has a bit of a lower head. Black ducks and mallards have fairly long necks, and it always struck me as odd that the man famous for his high head decoys produced black ducks with lower heads. It's also got the darker reverse feather stipple paint on the body. The lower black duck, that was a rig that was made for Stub Green, Horace Green. Stubb's wife was a nurse, and she had taken care of Frank's wife when she was ill. And as a thank you, in 1952, he made a special order of decoys for Horace Green. And that black duck was amongst that rig. And probably that was close to the end of his decoy production. And notice the paint is somewhat different. And the big thing to me is it's a lighter the feather stipples on that bird are a light paint on a dark background, whereas the other way, on the one on top, it's a light background with dark feather stippling. So, I mean, this is just a good example of the kinds of variations and painting style that could occur, sometimes from rig to rig. Definitely it occurred over the years as these guys carved for years and years. So let's look at a couple of Frank Coombs heads. There's an eye groove present. It's maybe not quite as obvious as it was on the Wheeler decoys, but it's there. The bill is outlined with a carved line, but there is no inletted areas, no wood removed at all. And there's no mandible lines. That might seem like an odd thing, and there are high head decoys that some people have attributed to Coombs with mandibles. I think they're incorrect. I think Coombs decoys, for almost all Coombs decoys, were simply carved without that mandible line. You know, everyone's an individual, you do things your own way, and these decoy carvers were certainly that way. And from time to time they changed, other things they kept consistent. And they're individuals, and as you collect their decoys and learn more about them, you recognize these idiosyncrasies they had versus someone else.
Would you say Coombs was an apprentice of Wheeler, or they sort of carved on their own? They
carved on their own.
Okay.
Wheeler was credited with giving him the idea of starting to carve decoys, but no, they carved very much on their own. I forgot to mention, Wheeler was, he lived on Holland Street in Alexandria Bay, and he was known as the Dean of Holland Street amongst the decoy people. Wintertime was a slow time for those people. You know, the river was frozen, the summer people were gone, a lot of the employment was gone. So it was a time to socialize for a lot of the men, and Wheeler had a shop out behind his house where he did his carving, other woodworking, and it was a very much of a gathering place for a lot of the local men. His daughter, Marie Toussaint, who passed away just a few years ago, always said that her father didn't think the shop was a fit place for a young woman. There's a bunch of men there telling stories, maybe they had a jug they were passing around or whatever. So he had a bell on the shop and a string that led to the house, and if she needed him, she was supposed to ring that bell, and he knew, okay, it's time to come to the house. But otherwise, it wasn't a proper place for a young lady to be. Notice also that that black duck does have the nostrils, the top left-hand corner. You can see the nostrils in the bill. The goldeneye, the Drake goldeneye, doesn't have nostrils, which is kind of unusual. Most of his goldeneyes did have nostrils. If we look at the bottom of a Coombs decoy, there's a couple of plugs, and that yellow area points to a 1/2-inch diameter plug, and that fills the hole left by his holding device. Carving a block of wood is tough. Some of the guys down south, they would go out back with a lathing hatchet, and they would hold the wood up and they would whack away pieces of wood to try and carve the birds. Most of the guys from our area seem to use that draw knife, but that's a two-handed tool. So you really need some way to secure the decoy block fairly securely while you're pulling that knife towards you and shaving off pieces of wood and carving the body. Frank Coombs had essentially would have been like a trailer hitch, a trailer ball, and he had a large diameter screw welded to the top of that. And he could hold that trailer ball in a vise, and then he would twist the decoy body block onto that lag screw, and it would hold the decoy securely enough so he could carve it. After he took the body block off, there'd be a hole in the bottom for that screw, and he would put a plug in there. Most decoys carved locally, or many decoys carved locally, had plugs in the bottom, and those plugs will help with identification. Coombs decoys typically have just the one plug there from the holding device. There is a second plug, a little bit larger diameter, right up in the head, and there's a hole drilled there, and then there's a screw put through to hold the head on. And so almost all decoys from our area, you'll see a plug up in the front for the head screw, and then probably plugs elsewhere in the body for the holding device. And of course, if they used a recycled piece of wood or something like that, there may be plugs in there because they're old nail holes or something like that. And you know, you don't want the water to get in there because it would swell the wood and everything else. So they would typically plug those things before the decoys were used. And actually, yeah, I did have an arrow there to show the red arrow for the plug over the head screw. So the bottoms of decoys are quite important for identification purposes about things like that. Talk a little bit about Sam Denny. He was from Clayton. He is certainly the prominent maker from Clayton, not the only one, but the prominent. He made decoys mostly in the winter, again, because he was a fishing guide, he painted houses, he had a big garden, he did stuff like that. During the open water season of the year, he was busy with other things. Wintertime was the time you could make decoys. Hopefully you're making something that you can sell next year and get some money for it. He carved from about 1900 to the 1950s. Supposedly he made 4,000 to 5,000 decoys in his lifetime. But like I say, that translates to not that many per year. If you 50 years, it's only 100 decoys a year. So they were part-time carvers. They did it to supplement their income. Now that bag of ducks he's got there, those are mostly goldeneye, so I'm going to start showing you some goldeneye decoys. And actually these 3 decoys are upstairs in the museum. From top to bottom, that's an immature drake, a hen, and then the mature drake down on the bottom. Goldeneyes and some of the other sea ducks of that similar family, they don't mature until their 2nd year of life. And so for that first 1.5 years of their life, the immature drake has plumage that looks like a hen. In the fall of their 2nd year, they begin to transition to the mature drake plumage, and they're kind of half and half. And that's obviously hunting time, and there were a number of local carvers that painted, occasionally they would paint that transitional plumage. They had a term for it, they called them the he-grays. And the hens they called brown heads, the drakes they usually called buck whistlers. A lot of little colloquial names for the different birds and things like that. But that immature drake up at the top, that's the only example by Sam Denny that we're aware of, showing an immature drake goldeneye. In the Vidot system and things like that, the Nickel family, they painted quite a few more decoys in that immature style. Here's some black ducks by Sam Denny. I think they're really great birds. I think he made the best black duck on the river. These have what I call scratch painting. Basically, he would put on the lighter color paint, let it dry, put on the darker color paint, and then take the end of a paintbrush or a stylus, some tool like that, a single tool, and scratch the paint off. And you'd have to do it many times. You can see the head on the black duck on the lower one. It's not as heavily scratched off as the top decoy. But all the Sam Denny decoys that I'm aware of in original paint had scratch painted heads. The lower decoy, the body is also scratch painted. It looks like he used a bigger stylus or brush or something, but he scratched the darker paint away to show lighter colored feathers through. And those feathers are pointed in the correct direction. He didn't do the reverse feather stippling. Yeah.
Did he put anything over the scratches once they were done, or did?
Nope.
I mean, if you're laying your hand across it, you're gonna feel all the
Yes,
scratches.
you could feel, the same thing with the combing. You could feel the texture in the back of the birds. Yeah. And some people would argue that that's the wonderful thing about oil paint. You would get texture from it and it wouldn't shine as much and everything else. And of course, if you go to an art museum or something like that, my wife loves some of the French artists, Impressionists, and Van Gogh and things like that. I mean, some of their paint was incredibly heavy. You get up close and look at it and how
Yeah,
thick and heavy
yeah.
that paint was. The top black duck, that's brush paint. He had a very small brush, and those feathers are individually brushed painted on. Again, tedious job, but they, maybe they had a radio. They certainly didn't have TV. And what else were they going to do? Okay, here's a broadbill pair by Sam Denny. Broadbills, bluebills. They're two very closely related species, the lesser scaup and the greater scaup. A lot of hunters can't even tell them apart. In most cases, the decoy carvers didn't bother to try and differentiate between them. Both are present on the St. Lawrence River. Depending on the time and the area, there'll be more of one or more of the other. What's a little bit different about these is the drake does have a little bit of a greenish cast to the head, and that would suggest that he was intentionally trying to represent the greater scaup. Both of these birds have combing on the back. The drake obviously a lot more combing. The hen, it's a little less. Very dark paint on the back of the hen. About half his hens had combing on the back, about half it was just blended paints on the back. Here are 3 drake canvasbacks by Sam Denny. And I just wanted to show a little bit different styles. The one on top, we call that the bullet head. It's a very sleek, streamlined head. He did that on a number of different species of ducks. The bird on the bottom left is the most typical form of Denny canvasback. It has a very prominent gray wing speculum on the side of the bird. The one in the middle there, it was a special rig he did for, I believe, for his son Leonard Denny, and a little bit different paint. And again, paint patterns varied. To what extent? That's because these guys were artists in their own right, maybe feeling somewhat repressed or unrequited or whatever, so that they would express themselves in their decoys. I've seen a number of Sam Denny broadbills where he didn't bother and paint the bottom. It's floating on the water. Who cares about the bottom ducks? There was paint on the bottom, but it wasn't painted like the belly of that duck would have been. But he did bother to blend the paints under the tail of the bird. Well, if you're not painting the bottom, why are you painting under the tail of the same area? The ducks aren't going to see it. But again, that's just some of the idiosyncrasies of the individual carvers and some of the fun of collecting the decoys, the different things they did.
You sat on a mirror, and people could see the mirror up on the back of the tail, but not underneath.
There you go. Okay, different head styles and different paint styles and shades. And of course, the paints they use, these oil-based paints, they hadn't carved decoys maybe in some months. And so the old paints were gone or they were used up, and they would mix batches of paint. And of course, oil-based paints, you could get the tinting colors and everything else, and it was a lot easier to mix things and everything else. And different batches of decoys often have different shading, different colored paints. Looking at the head of some Sam Denny decoys, there's a nice wide eye groove present. The bill is outlined with a carved line, gouged line, but no wood has been removed or inletted. The mandibles are present on these 2 examples, although if you notice the lower hen, there's also a little second line out on the tip of the bill. They varied. Some birds did not have mandibles. Almost all of them had nostrils, but I've seen some that didn't. It doesn't show because I'm not pointing the camera right at the tip of the bill, but they did have a little black nail painted on the tips of the bill on these birds. he almost never carved the nail on the bills, except some broad bills and then some of his black ducks he did. And actually the museum up in the collection has a pair of big, thick-bodied broad bills with a carved nail on the tip. Again, just some of the little differences that can occur between the decoys and the makers. Okay, here's a bottom of a Sam Denny and goldeneye. A lot of things you can see there. That little white collector label up near the front, that's mine. Don't worry about that. The AD on the bottom are initials carved in there. Almost certainly that was the initials of the man that owned the decoy. There's a couple of nail holes in there. Those nails held on the ballast weight, and you can see the outline or the shadow of that ballast weight has been removed. And there's also 3 plugs in the bottom of the decoy, and those I want to talk about. The 2 yellow areas point to 1/2-inch diameter plugs that filled the holes from his holding device, and they are in 2 and 5/8-inch centers. Sam Denny did not have a vise big enough to hold a body block, a decoy body block. So he would use apparently big lag screws and screw a smaller piece of wood, or perhaps it was metal, we don't know, it's been lost. He would screw this block, smaller block, onto the bottom of the decoy, and that he could secure in the jaws of his vise. So now he could use both hands with draw knife or whatever to shape the decoy. Afterwards, he would remove that block from the bottom, would leave holes, he'd have to plug them, he'd drill them out and put those little plugs in there. And almost all the Sam Denny decoys, the great majority of Sam Denny decoys, have those same 2 plug marks, and they're on 2 and 5/8-inch centers, varying maybe by a 1/16. It was the same block of wood. It was used on little bufflehead decoys, on bigger black duck decoys. There are some decoys where he put the holding device on the top of the bird so he could shape the area under the tail. And then he'd turn it over, put the block on the bottom. And so those have 2 sets of those holding device plugs. Very distinctive on Sam Denny decoys made from about 1918 to around World War II. According to the literature, prior to 1918, he had a holding device that left a single hole that he plugged. After World War II, at some time, he apparently got another vise or something, because I've seen decoys that were bought by a guy right after World War II. This was very late in Sam Denny's career. You could look at those birds and see, okay, these look like Sam Denny's. They're not quite as nice. He was getting older, probably a little less capable. But they did not have plugs in the bottom from a holding device. So apparently at some point, he got a better vise system or something like that. Okay, the red arrow points to that plug that goes to the head screw hole. Typically those 3 holes are all the same diameter, filled with the same material. Sometimes the head screw is bigger, different material, but the 2 in the back are, regardless of how big they are, and I've seen smaller ones like 3/8, I've seen bigger ones up to 5/8. They're on 2 and 5/8-inch centers, or very close to that.
The black spot by the D, is that
Yes.
for the anchor rope?
Yeah, that's a little conical area scooped out, and there's a staple in the bottom of it.
Okay.
And that staple was for the anchor line. Yes. And a lot of guys did things like that, but it's not consistent. Wheeler had things that they would take a gouge and scoop out an area, or if they had a drill that had a conical, they'd drill a conical spot there for the anchor line.
Right.
Gus Rogers, very well-known carver from Alexander Bay, he always used a big staple. And they're a real pain. You're trying to put the decoy on the shelf and you got this staple there, and the decoy often tends to wobble a bit and stuff. But this is what they did. This is, and the Chesapeake Bay, very often they took a big nail and they wanged it straight into the breast of the decoy, and then you could tie the line on the end of that. A nail would have a rounded head.
Right.
So different areas, different ways. The men used different techniques. Sometimes they were very consistent. Most of the time they weren't real consistent across their entire carving career. Okay, and 3 plugs in the bottom of the Sam Denny decoys. And again, it was about 1918, supposedly he switched over from that holding device that left a single hole to the one that left 2 holes. But a point I would make there is if you looked at the bottom of that decoy with the ballast weight on, you'd see only 1 plug from the holding device. The other one is hidden by the ballast weight. Sometimes you have to look twice at these things. Sam Denny did make some decoratives. He also did some paintings, and in fact the museum upstairs has 2 paintings by Sam Denny. And a lot of those he used the spelling of his French name, Denis, D-E-N-I-S, or I'm sure that's not the correct way to pronounce it. But he did use different spellings of his name. For a lot of his life he spelled his name D-E-N-N-E-Y, other times D-E-N-N-Y. He was a junior. I've often wondered if maybe the mail would get screwed up if he spelled it D-E-N-N-Y, they delivered to his father. But he spelled his name several different ways, and that it does add a little bit to the confusion of things. But he did make some of these decoratives. The mallards, the hen mallard there, the one in front, is hollow. The drake in back with a little tail curl, that's actually made with a cork body. It has inletted wood, and the head is wood, but most of the body is cork. He did make a bunch of miniatures, and the Corbin Studios here in town had a whole collection of little miniatures that he made, and it included some species that, as far as we know, he didn't make full-size hunting decoys for. No. These guys did a lot of different things, and I find that the paintings, the miniatures, some of the odd things that they did to be a really nice addition to a collection. It's not just a bunch of ducks, there are these other things.
Did they do different things at different times of their stages of their career? Or
Probably,
just sort of
but
all
it's
through?
not well documented.
Oh, okay.
And like with Denny, the paintings he did and things like that, a lot of that was given away as gifts.
Right.
Weddings, Christmas, things like that. And so okay, so this was the 3 main, the big 3 decoy carvers from the area, 2 from Alexander Bay, Sam Denny from Clayton. I'm gonna move on real quick to Ken Harris. Usually you see Woodville, but Ken Harris was born and largely raised in Watertown. He began making decoys in Watertown, and then he moved down to Woodville. By 1948, he was moved to Woodville, and that's where he's associated with. But he did move around. He began carving in the late 20s. He became full-time in 1944. That's when he was still in Watertown. And there was a newspaper article in the December 48 Watertown Daily Times. And they interviewed Ken Harris. They took some pictures and everything else. And in that interview, he said, we made 4,600 decoys this year. And he was selling the decoys for wholesale distribution to different stores. And he said in 8 different states. So he was sending the decoys all over the place. His son William and some other people were helping him. This next photograph, that was in the barn. That well-known display area on Route 3 that Ken Harris had was built later in the late 50s, I believe. There was a barn behind, that's where they did the carving. That's where the initial display area is. Those decoys that you see on the shelves, most of them have cork bodies or tupelo wood. And tupelo was a species of wood that grows down south in some of the swamp areas. It's one of those trees that has the big wide base. And it is very rot resistant, reasonably soft and everything else. And he was getting loads of tupelo wood to carve his wooden decoys from.
So would that be faster carving that than it would have been the cedar, do you think?
Probably not much difference. It would have been relatively similar. Later he began carving a lot of his decoys from pine. He faced the same problems that the old guys did. It's hard to get wood, harder than you would imagine. And especially you've got to get it and let it dry for at least 6 months, preferably a couple of years. And so getting good dried wood was always an issue. But notice there's also some miniatures up on the shelf there. Ken Harris, this is in 1948. At that time, he was beginning to make miniatures. And over time, his decoy making transitioned from the hunting decoys to the decoratives, including miniatures. And like I say, I think it was in the late 50s, he built that retail shop. He stopped the wholesale distribution of decoys, and he just operated from his retail shop right there on Route 3 in Woodville. Here's some examples of some very early Ken Harris decoys. The goose up in the top left is a cork body. It's got a thin wooden bottom board and then an inset wooden tail. The head and neck are wood. The other decoys are wood. Probably those are fairly early hunting decoys. The little teal up in the top right, that might be from that tubular wood. I'm not an expert enough on Harris decoys to really be certain. The hen on the bottom with that really long tail, that's almost certainly pine or cedar. Jerry Knapp used to work a little bit with Ken Harris, and he talked about the pencil cedar that he used, which I believe was Western red cedar, they have brought in to carve decoys from. And if you're making thousands of decoys in a year, the amount of wood you go through was a lot. Here's some examples of the later style decorative decoys based on the brands and the stamps on the bottom of these. These are probably mid-70s. The decorative birds, they were much more inclined to do the more colorful drakes, and they did a lot of wood ducks and teal, mergansers, things like that that have the very colorful drakes. It displays a little better on the shelf. Most hunters would never use a drake wood duck like that. Those raised wings and everything are much too fragile. They break off right away. There were a few preening decoys used in hunting. They did try and change the rig around some. But these are later decorative decoys produced by Ken Harris.